Thank you, Beatriz. Are you going to start the video for me?
I think you have to start.
It tells me that you're blocking my video.
No, no.
¿Pasó? Dice que está bloqueado el video.
Okay, there we go.
Very good. Thank you. Okay, thank you so much. Really, it's a great honor to be with the Institute and such a very distinguished group of panelists. Great honor. And Beatriz, let me congratulate you on your recent article on the resilience of Chilean democracy, which I thought was really quite brilliant. And I suggest, if you haven't already, to circulate it to everyone listening to this session. So let me begin with a confession. I am an optimist. I see a glass half full, and I reject the mainstream negative narrative of the hemisphere that emphasizes widespread democratic backsliding and debilitating economic stagnation. In judging progress, it depends on the metrics, right? And I always tell my students, set a low bar. Set a low bar. You're more likely to achieve success and to reach happiness. Utopian goals are too often the bane of Latin American politics, and that's the path to frustration and disillusionment. I have 50 years perspective now on inter-American relations. I see some gray-haired panelists that have a similar perspective. And I would maintain that for most, if not all, Latin American families today, compared to 30, 50 years ago, living conditions have improved immeasurably in many countries, dramatically so. And as mentioned already, in most places, pluralistic democracy is the only game in town. Most younger folks throughout the region have only lived under democratic governments. That is the only game that they are aware of and see as possible and as probable. So let me say that the Institute, as an institute and as individuals, you have good reasons to celebrate these historic advances. Don't allow the naysayers to deprive you of your honors, your well-deserved honors. Okay, U.S. leverage today is less than it was. Of course, we're in a more multilateral world. U.S. prestige was at its apogee after World War II and at the end of the Cold War, when it was needed most in the hemisphere, when the region was transitioning from closed authoritarian states to more liberal democratic societies and more open economies. The U.S. was there in many countries at critical moments to assist definitively, successfully, to assist local reformers. But now, local institutions are stronger in most countries. They can stand tall largely on their own foundations. Okay, we are all terribly aware of important exceptions to these arcs of progress. We all know these cases. Some of you from your own personal, painful, traumatic experiences. We've seen that years, in some cases decades, of fierce economic sanctions imposed by the United States and in some cases by others. These intense, prolonged economic sanctions have not succeeded. Instead of driving transitions to democracy, what we find is stubborn authoritarian resilience. We find authoritarian regimes, despite minority popular support, can still maintain themselves in power. They can control state resources. They have loyal political organizations. They have a pervasive security apparatus armed with modern surveillance techniques. Political realism, therefore, requires us to recognize these adverse trends and to pose some new creative approaches beyond just more and more economic sanctions, which have not produced the desired results. Now, economics, we didn't get the FTAA, okay, as initially suggested, as was pointed out by Beatriz, by Bush Sr. But the region is interlaced with dozens of free trade agreements. And the United States has free trade agreements with Mexico, Central America, and the Pacific coast of South America. That's all positive developments. But we find throughout much of the region, in economics, stronger policymaking, better educated policymakers, much more stable monetary policies in most countries, more flexible exchange rates, much more public policy transparency. We find both stronger states and stronger markets, and vast improvements in social services as we approach the UN Sustainable Development Goals in many countries, even as we have to recognize this recent setbacks from COVID-19. Now, in trade policy, in both the United States, both political parties, Democrats and Republicans, now seem to be drifting towards a trade skepticism, tilting towards greater protectionism. Okay, so let's not talk anymore about trade liberalization. Let's not talk about FDI. Let's talk about global value chains. Let's talk about friendshoring. Let's talk about nearshoring, because these are so evidently in the national interest of the United States. Nearshoring, global value chains, is the most creative, affirmative response to Chinese competition. And the US has begun to move in that direction of incentivizing regional global supply chains, nearshoring, if you will. And to that extent, I recommend the recent article that appeared just yesterday in Foreign Affairs magazine by Shannon O'Neill on the opportunities for nearshoring in inter-American relations, potentially transformative. And in the area of international value chains, policies which were controversial just 10 years ago are now mainstream, that global supply chains must honor internationally recognized labor standards, they must respect the environment, and advance gender equity. All big advances in the trade and investment space. Now, it is often lamented that the US doesn't pay enough attention to the region. Well, as initially mentioned, by the way, by Beatriz, gracias a Dios, in this region, there's no threatening nuclear weapons, no vicious Hamas, no interstate wars that demand our attention. Yeah, sure, the US could do better, could put more attention to the region, but responsibility for inter-American diplomacy must be shared. A more activist United States in the region would need more willing and able partners. But let's look around, frankly. Today, the Mexican president is proudly parochial. He never travels. Brazil imagines it can solve conflicts in Central Europe and in the Middle East, turning its back on its own hemisphere where it formerly imagined that it could be a leader. And Argentina, bueno, quien sabe. In contrast to that situation in the Americas, if a US president flies to Europe and NATO, if a US president flies to Tokyo or Seoul or to ASEAN, he can anticipate warm welcomes and willing, eager allies. That's what we don't have in the inter-American system. And therefore, to argue that the US should spend more time and more effort and more capital, political capital on the region would require more affirmative response and more capabilities and willingness in the region itself. Okay, so what do we have in terms of inter-American relations? And this will be my last major point. In response to this fragmented, contentious hemisphere, the US has evolved what I would call a multi-tiered multilateralism. You have inclusive multilateralism, you have plurilateralism, and then you have traditional bilateralism. I described this, by the way, in a recent article in the Wilson Quarterly. You have the universal institutions, the OAS and the IDB. Perhaps they don't have the clout that they had in their earlier, more formative years. But the OAS was important in the recent defense of democracy in Guatemala. And how exciting was that? Compare that to all the travails of Guatemala famously in 54 and in the early 90s, 80s and 90s. So the OAS was very dramatic and a beautiful example there of multi-pronged diplomacy and safeguarding democracy in Guatemala. The IDB is now under competent Brazilian leadership. It will help finance the important energy transition to cleaner energy. And then the third pillar of universal multilateralism, IDB, OAS, is summitry. Summitry engages the head of state. We're coming upon the 30th anniversary of the first Summit of the Americas, you all remember, in Miami in 1994. And in 2025, we will have the 10th Summit of the Americas. And summits, some are good, some are mediocre, but they have given us some moments of high drama, and they have made their contributions. When ideological fragmentation across nations makes inclusive cooperation, full multilateralism, not possible, the U.S. diplomats turned to plurilateralism, to sub-regional accords. Recent examples at the Los Angeles Summit of the Americas last year, in 2022, we had agreements, plurilateral agreements on migration, which, if you read them, actually are pretty substantive. And then we had the launching of the Americas Partnership for Economic Prosperity, APEP, which is intended to promote nearshoring. We'll see if that can actually make real progress on the ground, because we have within the administration, we much recognize the foot dragging of Catherine Tai at USTR, which represents the more protectionist wing of the Democratic Party and the Biden administration. And I would say she's made it difficult for APEP to really move forward. But it's out there, and it's something that I keep urging my friends in Latin America to grab and run with. Now, that's plurilateralism. We still, of course, have bilateralism, and they're the great example, trilateralism with the USMCA. I live on the border here in San Diego, and the relationships with Mexico are complex, very multifaceted, very intense on a daily basis, itself a topic for a long seminar. And then other issues that are handled mostly bilaterally, counter-narcotics, cybersecurity, mostly bilateral. So, to summarize my talk, Beatriz, I think did I stick to my 15 minutes? To summarize
time.
quickly,
You still have time.
What's that?
You still have time. You have 5 more minutes.
Well, I'll do better than that, leave more time for my fellow panelists, and then we can have more of a discussion. But to summarize, inter-American relations rests on the foundations of liberal democracy, more open markets, both stronger states and stronger markets. Authoritarian resilience in some countries is real, and policy failures by the international community suggest the need for some fresh approaches. Meanwhile, inter-American relations have evolved a flexible menu of instruments, including inclusive multilateralism, plurilateralism, and our standard bilateralism. Going forward, the hemisphere has a very rich agenda. We have the restructuring of global trade and investment, of global value chains, nearshoring, tremendous, which could transform inter-American relations and really integrate it in a very meaningful and dynamic way across a number of important sectors. Immigration, which I haven't really spent much time on, it's a very big polarizing issue. But, after all is said and done, the U.S. continues to admit over 1 million immigrants a year legally. And that's so we, despite all the negative press and some of the rhetoric from some quarters, the U.S. still remains a relatively open society. And then the other big topic, of course, is climate change and clean energy. And there, the hemisphere has huge advantages: natural resources, minerals, wind, and sunshine in abundance. So looking forward on the issues of global value chains, on movements of peoples, and of climate change, the potential for really creative and deep inter-American cooperation is all very real. So Beatriz, thank you very much for this opportunity. Looking forward to engage with our distinguished panelists in the remainder of the program. Thank you so much.
Thank you.